I did want to ask you about woke. I mean, you can't talk to Rod Liddle and not ask him about wokery.
The trans stuff was helped greatly by the arrival of the TERFs, who are now beginning to get on my feet a bit, actually. If I could just say, just between me and you, there are better books to burn than the Quran, James O'Brien's latest, for example. But there should be no law against doing so. But we've built this for ourselves, and we've built it without ever saying to the electorate, look, our plan over the next 5 years is to let 2 million people into the country, most of them from backwards communities in Pakistan. Do you fancy that? When you hear a Labour MP channeling Enoch.
Island of strangers.
You know how disastrous it's been for.
Where do you think the Tories are going now?
Robert Jenrick is basically Ed Davey on ketamine, isn't he? I mean, it's just bizarre. Swooping in on passengers on the tube.
Do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back to the barrier and pay?
Do you think we will see a tearing up of the ruling regime in this country like we've seen in others?
If you're in a BBC studio on the morning that Nigel Farage wins the 2029 election, you will think it's quite dramatic from the tears shed on the floor and the wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Rod Liddle. Rod, welcome to the show. It's great to have you back on. It's been far too long since we last spoke. There's so much I want to ask you about. I feel like you're the person to go to for common sense in a world gone crazy. But we have to kick off with Keir Starmer, the government. We're heading for a year of this government, almost. It feels like it's been 10 years, but it's almost a year now. What's your take? Is it worse than you expected it to be? Is it a little bit better? Where do you think it's all going?
I think the first 100 days were excruciatingly bad, with a number of missteps. One of them, obviously, the winter fuel payments, but allied to the winter fuel payments, a decision by the government to pay off its clients, such as train drivers, such as public sector workers, and a disastrous budget. Things did improve round about, well, as soon as Trump took office. It seemed to sort of stiffen the sinews a little bit of this government. And I thought we saw Sir Keir Starmer behaving with a certain adroitness on the international stage. And also other members of his government, such as Lisa Nandy and a couple of others, Shabana Mahmood, making sort of intelligently blue Labour decisions over stuff such as trans, and indeed stuff about the sentencing business, which the government opposed the idea that we should be judging people according to what colour their skin is rather than according to what crime they commit. So that was all good, but since then. And some of it's been of Starmer's making, but it's more to the point, it's existential. There is nothing they can do. Now, there's also nothing the Tories can do. And that they are both strung out between two sets of an electorate which believe in diametrically opposed things.
Yeah.
It's not simply that there are differences. It's that on every single issue, whether it be net zero, whether it be immigration, whether it be wokery, whether it be defence, the whole lot, you will find a completely different answer amongst Labour voters in the south or the affluent areas than you would in the north. There is nothing they can do about that. And so they've been cut up by both parties, cut up by Reform UK. And I just do not see how they can square those circles. I just don't think it's squareable, as Euler predicted.
Yeah, it is like there are two Englands, to use an old phrase from the 19th century, where people talk about the politics of compromise or the politics of consensus. That's kind of impossible in a world in which there are two parts of the country, geographically, maybe generationally, certainly in terms of class, who believe diametrically opposed things on these key issues, as you say.
Yeah.
And Labour kind of embodies it straddles those two worlds, I guess. It gets votes from wealthy people down south, and it still gets votes from some working class people up north. Where do you think Labour will fall on that divide? I mean, it seems pretty obvious that Keir Starmer and the rest of them, that they're really on the side of the wealthier Labour voters. But when you look at something like Starmer's recent speech and white paper on immigration and his admission that this sometimes feels like an island of strangers and diversity has downsides, is that him just running away from Nigel Farage nipping at his heels, or do you think it represents a bit of a shift of opinion in those circles?
I think it represents a shift of opinion. I think it's down to who's advising them. You know, I know Morris has been advising them, Morris Glassman, and Morgan McSweeney is, in everything but named Blue Labour. So very much on my kind of page. Yeah. But the trouble is, it cannot hold. The structural problems within the Labour vote are so immense that I don't think they will have any choice other than for electoral reasons to go back to the kind of affluent wokery which they were used to. And because don't forget, they're not just hemorrhaging votes to the Lib Dems and to the Greens. There's also this third tranche, which is the Muslim vote, which they lost, I think, something in the region of 30% of the Muslim vote deserted them at the last election. They've been able to bank on 64% of Muslims voting Labour. They can't do that anymore because of what's happened with Gaza. So they really are in difficulties. I think you're right. I mean, I think the obvious thing to say is that in the end, because of the weight of the party being in that direction, they will go back to being the party we remember as being representative of an affluent, educated elite, rather than the Red Wall, because they're getting no votes up here at all. I mean, Kent was remarkable. The Kent County Council vote was remarkable. But, where I am now, it was a Labour majority, a massive Labour majority. Labour's held Durham for more than 100 years. They've now got 6 or 8 councillors. I think it's 8 councillors. It's just remarkable. And the Tories have got 1. It's incredible. And it is. I think it's why I said at the time, I thought that they were the most significant electoral results we've had in 30 or 40 years, because I do think it looks like it's the end of, the two-party political system.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that. And, Labour, I think you've described Labour's situation very well, which is that it's trying at the moment to appeal to its more sensible working class voters, but it's not convincing. I think it's bound to fall apart at some point. But in relation to the Conservative Party, as you say, they are not doing very well either. What's your thinking on the current leadership there? What's your take on Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, who seems to be constantly nipping at her heels and trying to push himself forward as a successor to her if things fall apart? Where do you think the Tories are going now?
Yes, Robert Jenrick is basically Ed Davey on ketamine, isn't he? It's just bizarre. It's sort of swooping in on passengers on the tube, and then the next minute pops up somewhere else. When I spoke to Kemi at the weekend, her argument is that it is no use coming in with all guns blazing. You have to rebuild the trust in the party. That takes time, and the policies have to be thought out, well considered, and not sort of Faragist, as she put it. It's still, we're halfway through the 2-year period which she said it takes the electorate to forgive a ruling government. They're on 16% in the polls. They're behind the Lib Dems. They're only just above the Greens. It has been absolutely disastrous, and for exactly the same reasons as Labour. Exactly the same reasons, in that their fox has been shot by Nigel Farage, and they have to decide whether to chase Farage and therefore win the Red Wall votes, or some of them, or consolidate, because they too are losing seats heavily to the Lib Dems and possibly Labour in the south. So it is a thankless job for her. I think she's a clever woman, and I know she's committed to the job. I don't see how she does it. Every complaint she makes about Labour, the response comes back, well, you had 14 years. Even on Chagos, Liz Truss was busy thinking about ways to give away to the Chagos Islands, So I genuinely, you have to remember that the Conservative Party is the most adaptable and resilient of all our political parties, but it is difficult to see how it comes back from this. You could just about see it with Labour. If there was an economic upturn, if somehow bizarrely Rachel Reeves got her figures right, if the economy was on course and people had a bit more money in their pockets, you could see a revival in Labour's fortunes a bit. But of course, none of that would help Kemi.
Yeah, exactly. It is extraordinary what's happened to the Conservative Party. Arguably the most successful political party in the Western world in the modern era, in terms of how long they governed for, the ideas they brought to bear, the political figures they foisted onto Britain and the world. I mean, to see them now, as you say, just ahead of the Greens, struggling with the Lib Dems of all people, the worst party surely in Western Europe.
Absolutely,
it's extraordinary, isn't it? Historically, it's extraordinary.
Well, I don't know, and I'm not sure the Tories know what they're there for anymore. When I spoke to Kemi, she kept making this point, which is that we are to the right of the Reform UK party. And Nigel Farage is basically Jeremy Corbyn in a Union Jack T-shirt, which is her phrase of choice, which kind of sums up my politics, if I'm honest. And it sums up a lot of people's politics up here in the Northeast. They like John McDonnell's tax proposals. They like the idea of nationalising the utilities. It was the lack of patriotism and the wokery which they didn't like. And the support for every country other than Britain, every evil has tried to attack us. But Kemi then says we're to the right of reform. How does that play in Saffron Walden and Barnes and Tunbridge Wells? We're voting for people who are to the right of Nigel Farage. It just doesn't figure. I just do not see how that figures.
Yeah, I love that idea of Jeremy Corbyn in a Union Jack T-shirt. There are lots of people around the country who would vote for that. Probably not Absolutely. The original Corbynistas, but there are lots of people who would. When Kemi Badenoch and others in the Conservative Party say we don't want to be too Farageist, we don't want to go down that road, what is that a mistake on their part, do you think? Because on the one hand, we have Labour that seems to be, well, the accusation is that Labour is mimicking certain Farageist talking points in order to try to win back the working class. Then you have the Tories who are kind of running from Faragism or trying to distinguish themselves from it. But the truth of the matter is, you wrote about this in The Spectator recently, you wrote an apology to Reform saying, look, I underestimated you guys. The truth is there are a lot of people out there who want that kind of populist, Faragist politics, who want reform. They're voting for them. So something's going well. How much of a challenge do you think reform poses to those two parties? And are they going to deal with that challenge well or not?
I think the way it's going at the moment, the challenge to the Conservative Party is, as said at the beginning, existential. It can do away with the Conservative Party, effectively. The one area which Kemi might mine a little bit more profitably is tax cuts. If she retreated into a degree of Trussism, then there is an appetite for that. There is an appetite. Well, we've always talked, Brendan, it used to be that all British political parties were kind of fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Now in the position where they're all fiscally left-wing and socially changing back to being conservative. Basically, what they've been doing, Brendan, they've listened to me. It's basically what it is. Yeah.
But
I think there still is an appetite for Kemi to sell a party which is low on taxation and where endeavour and entrepreneurial spirit and doing the right thing, saving money and so on is rewarded rather than penalised.
Yeah.
Now, she wouldn't get the red wall, but she might get kind of traditional Tories. But other than that, I don't see where she goes. And as I say to the voters in the South who might be considering voting Conservative, we're to the right of reform. I think it's a really, really hostage to fortune.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned Blue Labour earlier, and the brilliant Maurice Glassman, who I think is a very sensible political figure in this country. There's also the SDP, who are not a million miles away from Blue Labour. That's a party you're very familiar with. It's a party I'm familiar with. It seems to me that the moment has come for that kind of politics in a way, in the sense that there is an appetite out there, I think, for people who are looking for something new. They're not free marketeers. They don't want to let the market run riot. Quite the opposite, in fact. They think the state has an important role to play in maintaining relations between the market and the individual, keeping people healthy and well if they run out of money, etc., etc. But at the same time, they are sick and tired of the trans lunacy, what is referred to as social liberalism, which is often just kind of individualist anarchy, as far as I can tell. So there is an appetite for that kind of new politics, or really an old politics repackaged, that Blue Labour represents, the SDP represents. Do you think that turning point is coming, or are we just headed for a showdown between Farage and the two main parties for the next few years, and Blue Labour types might struggle to find a way into that?
I was being tongue-in-cheek when I said they'd been listening to me, but not entirely tongue-in-cheek. Because the truth is that I've been saying, and Morris has been saying, and various other people have been saying, for years and years and years, that the appetite is for a fiscally progressive party which is socially conservative. And that's what all three parties are trying to be at the moment. And the SDP, I don't know if I can use words like this on your podcast, I think we're fucked. Frankly, Brendan, because Reform have taken our clothes, they've taken our policies, they've taken our slogans, They've taken faith, flag and family, they've taken our married tax allowance, nationalisation, they've taken a lot. They are the SDP, whether they mean it or not, as we do, they don't quote Aristotle like we do, they're not as well read as we are. We're a very well-read party. We can trace our roots back all the way to Aristotle, through Vico, through bits of Marx, but through the Christian social teaching and so on. They can trace their lineage back to having heard what we said a few weeks ago. So excuse the annoyance. But they've done it, and they've done it very successfully, because Farage realised, much as J.D. Vance realises, that that's where the appetite is, for within the electorate. So the remarkable thing is that we could head into the next election with not one of the 4 or 5 main parties proposing a fiscally conservative budget. It's remarkable. That is a huge change. But at the moment, the thing I got wrong about Reform was there was this thing that they could never break through 25%. They still kind of haven't. There's one outlier poll which gave them 29, but it no longer looks as if they can't break through that anymore. And I notice it round here when I talk to people who 4 or 5 years ago I'd say to them, "What way did you vote?" And they would put their arm around me and shepherd me into a corner and say, "I voted Reform." Whereas now it's Reform. No shame, no worry about it. Reform has become respectable. So I don't know where their benchmark is, where it stops. Is it 35%? Is it 30%? That's the crucial issue. And Nigel Farage will say it's 40%. It's probably a minority of the public, but I suspect it's a very, very, very large minority of the public.
So in relation to Reform's rise and their success in the recent local elections, and the fact that many working class people, as you say, are now quite proud of the fact that they vote for them, whereas you used to have the phenomenon of the shy Reform voter or the shy UKIP voter, even the shy Brexit voter. That's why polls are so often wrong these days, because people don't want to tell them what they're doing because they know they'll be judged for doing it. So do you think that the old argument from the media class in particular that Reform is far right and Nigel Farage is basically a little Englander Hitler, all that stuff that we've had for years and years and years, which I think it's important that we don't forget it. Do you think that's kind of run out of steam? Is it that doesn't work anymore, does it? It seems to be disappearing.
The BBC no longer refers to Reform as far right. You know, it habitually did that out of stupidity and bias. It no longer does that. I think there are various other things as well which have changed. I mean, the what we used to call woke agenda is surely in recession. I mean, I can remember the term I used when I thought it was in recession, talking to you a few years ago. And I think actually it was beginning to tilt over, but you know, trans is gone. I think trans is gone. I think the next big battle is the odious and divisive race business, which permeates all our senior establishments, all the places that run us. So I think all that's changed. And I don't think people are frightened of saying, no, I think someone with a cock is probably a man, you know? And I'm not going to apologize for being white. I think those are two reasonable, sensible standpoints to take, which 5 years ago would have got you into trouble. And now don't. So our institutions are still very much in step with the stuff which is already on its way out. And I don't know what one does about that. I just don't know what one does about that. The best thing to do is the doging, which both Kent and Durham will have, and which has been done very successfully in America. That works, I think. And also, I like the idea of penalising countries which use DEI targets. I think that's terrific.
I did want to ask you about woke. I mean, you can't talk to Rod Liddle and not ask him about wokery and all that crap that's going on. The phrase you used when we did a live podcast, I think it must be 7 years ago. It was a long time ago now. You refer to it as peak wank, which is another way of saying peak woke, I guess. I think you were probably a little bit premature because the craziness did carry on for a little bit longer.
I always am in circumstances like that.
Let's just talk about the trans thing to begin with, because I think you're right. That seems to be going, and it's not going voluntarily, and it's not going by accident. It's going because people pushed back against it incredibly hard. Many of those people actually were old left-wing feminists and radical feminists. And then, of course, J.K. Rowling and others too. You know, it wasn't actually the conservative lobby, which kind of swept in towards the end of the crisis of trans and claimed responsibility for it. But it kind of came from somewhere else. It does seem that's on the way out.
Reality. I think it came from reality. It just came from watching an 18-stone basketball player punching some woman in the head. You know, that's what it came from. It came from court cases arising out of the I forgot the name of it, thank God, Tavistock Clinic. You know, it came from that kind of stuff. And it came from a sort of general reawakening of sense that you can't tell people, you can't tell people a downright lie, which is what they were doing. They were telling kids, they were telling the rest of us downright lies which must not be gainsaid. And I think a lot of that has gone. Yes, undoubtedly, the trans stuff was helped greatly by the arrival of the TERFs, who are now beginning to get on my tits a bit, actually. If I could just say, just between me and you, That's all they've been banging on about. If they laid the road, right, which led to this absurdity with gender. They actually got the tarmac out and laid the road for it. Suzanne Moore, where they used to hold three thoughts simultaneous of this, which was men subjugate women. Women are better than men. There's no difference between men and women. And they were able to argue those three things simultaneously without blushing, and as soon as you've said there is no essential difference between men and women, you've got your first fucking trans toilet block, basically,
Yeah.
So I think it's time for a bit of introspection on the part of these TERFs who haven't half been coining it in the right-wing press. Right-wing press takes on all these lefty women who have just spent the last 5 years going, trans! That's right. Right, well, it's gone. Now what are you going to write about? The rather interesting thing is that some of them, the more thoughtful, it's as if the scales have been removed from their eyes, and they're now saying, oh, yes, Israel does have a point, doesn't it? And all the things they'd argued against for years. Yes, men are treated terribly well at the moment. It's so on and so on. Yeah. Anyway, that was a spiteful digression.
No, I think that's really true. The scales falling from eyes, I've noticed that with quite a few people who, who would have been, relatively straightforward, leftish feminists 5 years ago, and now they are saying those kinds of things. So the trans thing has been a bit of a gateway drug to a kind of common sense more broadly. But on the trans issue, I did want to ask you, I think you're right, it's on its way out, and I think it just crashed against reality. It crashed against people's common sense. But we do need a reckoning with it at some point, don't we? I mean, we do need to ask how we ended up with a ruling class that thought you could have a cock and be a lesbian. And, if you look at the case of Imran Khalif, the Algerian boxer, it's now pretty clear that this is a bloke, or it's someone who's certainly got blokish chromosomes. Last year in the Paris Olympics, you had people like Leo Varadkar, the former Taoiseach of Ireland, saying, "You go, girl," when Imran Khalif was punching a woman in the face. You had, this was basically a leader in the Western world cheering on a man beating up a woman for sport. So when we look back on that,
idiot. Varadkar was an idiot.
He was a total idiot. Yeah. But we need an analysis of how all that happened, don't we, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And I mean, it still is happening. Don't forget. Oldie is currently donating money to a charity which supports trans people and all the lunacy of trans through its sale of pride-bedecked Kevin the Carrot puppets. I mean, it's still there. It's still there, and it'll take a lot of time to root out. But a few sackings wouldn't come amiss, would they? I'm sorry, you got this all completely wrong. Fuck off. And that is the approach we should be taking, and it's the approach which I think reform is taking. We're not having DEI anymore. We're not having that. We're going to get rid of it, and we're going to get rid of most of the net zero rubbish as well. Is what they're saying, and I think that's going to be very popular with the electorate, and if they can lower council taxes as well, all well and good. I mean, you're right. We need a reckoning, or we just need to crow a bit more about how we were right and point out the people who weren't. I remember what you were saying 5 years ago, Starmer, and you, Rayner. Yeah, your ginger growler. We all remember that, and that needs to be repeated. And Penny Mordaunt, and the Conservative Party generally. Yes, you're right. We need to hold them to account.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a species of hysteria that swept through the corridors of power, and that definitely we need to think about how that happened.
As was BLM, of course.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to come on to the question of race, actually, and whether you think that's in trouble too. You did mention earlier on that people are now much more upfront about saying if you've got a cock, you're a man, and it's not a sin, it's not a crime against humanity to be white. I do think there are more people saying that in reaction against the lunacies of the past 5 or 10 years. But it does feel like sometimes one step forward, 2 steps back, because you do keep hearing, the latest thing is about kids being taught that not all Vikings were white, so some were black. And you still have that stuff in schools and universities, and this obsession with race, which seems to go against everything we've been taught is good since the 1960s, which you shouldn't obsess over race. It's still there, isn't it? And it does feel like that issue, I think trans is probably dying, but it does feel like that issue could explode back into public life.
Oh, well, I think it's with the institutions again, and I think it's going to be a generation to change all that. We have to change a generation of teachers, and the race stuff is far, far more difficult because we don't really have a turf army to fight it, if you know what I mean. There isn't that same extra block which enabled us to, tip over the avalanche on trans. And this stuff, the American universities are still coming out with it. And our universities are still coming out with it. And we're still decolonizing. It's very, very difficult without, I mean, I don't know what the answer is to this. It would be great if it were black-led, and some of it is, Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, people from within the black and ethnic minority communities saying, do you realize how deranged this is always important and could be the thing which wins it. How dare you say that I've been subjugated? I'm the leader of the Conservative Party. So you would hope that there will be some recompense, but of course it's very difficult if you're black and in Britain and you're told you're discriminated against institutionally as part of 300 years of wickedness on the part of white folk, and you're maybe not very happy, you don't have a great job, and you think maybe it's true. I don't blame black and Asian people for kind of cleaving to this. We all cleave to something, but it would be great if the black and Asian community would really come out and say, no, this is not remotely how it is.
Yeah.
The history stuff is the important thing, Once you demolish the ludicrous idea that Africa's economic and governmental problems are, they would say, solely a cause of colonialism, but even a cause of were caused by colonialism, when they weren't remotely. If we could have an honest sort of look at that, you point to Ethiopia and Liberia and Mauritius as countries which weren't colonized so much, and doing exactly the same as the countries around them. It's an absurdity. It'll take years, I suspect.
Yeah. And I think you're right that there are those quite brave voices, actually, from the ethnic minority communities. We did a great interview with Tony Sewell recently on the lunacy of Black Lives Matter. And I think those kinds of voices are incredibly important. Yeah, he's great.
Tony's fabulous, a great mate as well, and never afraid to say what he believes based on rational analysis and stats. He's done the work.
Yeah. So, I mean, things are changing. Some of them are good. Some of them are bad. Some of them we don't quite know yet if it will be good or bad. But then things happen that make me despair, as always. And one of those things recently, this week, in fact, was the finding guilty of the man who burnt the Quran outside the Turkish consulate in London. What's your view on that? How have you responded to that case?
It's a disgraceful decision. It was clearly a prosecution which the Crown Prosecution Service and the DPP were very, very nervous about, which is how initially they had a charge down, which was clearly and simply blasphemy.
Yeah.
And then were forced to change it because they realised that the mood has changed. I think they get that the mood has changed on this stuff. It was horrific. Obviously, I mean, I wouldn't go around burning the Quran. You know, I mean, there are better books to burn than the Quran. James O'Brien's latest, for example. But there should be no law against doing so.
Yeah.
And now he's going to go around the country, I believe, but Qurans wherever he can, which is going to cause more and more trouble. There are still loads of these cases of the police being involved where they shouldn't be involved. But when you have a Labour government saying the police shouldn't be doing this, it's slightly at odds in that some of this is a consequence of the governmental intervention and involvement in the prosecution of people who took part in riots a year ago. You know, that was clearly politicised, and they admit it was politicised. They say it was our job to do that. But since then, there has been a certain stepping back, and I think I'm more comfortable with where we're heading with that, because it seems to me that everyone now, including a Labour government, thinks the police should maybe arrest a few burglars and leave people who are, you know, saying stuff online alone a bit. Not in Scotland, as we've seen with Craig Houston, but generally, I think there's a general move towards that.
What does it say about Britain, well, to itself, but also to the world, when someone can be charged with a religiously aggravated crime for burning the Quran? I'm like you. I wouldn't burn the Quran. I wouldn't burn any books. If you don't like a book, give it to a charity shop. You know, putting books on fire.
No, the James O'Brien book, Brendan.
James O'Brien. I'll join you in that one. We should do that. But what does it say about this country? Because, and what does it say to our Muslim community? That's one thing that I've been thinking about, because if certain sections of the Muslim community, perhaps the more radicalized younger people, the Islamist wing, you know, the kind of radical wing who we know are out there, if they get the impression that it's a punishable thing to disrespect their religion, I mean, that's going to be a nightmare, right?
Yes, though I think, wasn't the conviction more about inflaming public feeling?
Yeah.
So there was a subtle difference there. You know, I don't know what would, if I went into a Pentecostal church and started burning the Bible, I'm not sure I wouldn't be arrested. You know, I'm not suggesting I'm about to do that, by the way. Somebody actually believes in God, but I don't think the case with this guy Korpak, isn't it? What was his name? I've forgotten his name. Is quite that clear cut. I think there's wriggle room there. But what it says to our Muslim community is we are still craven. That's, I think, basically what it says. But I think there are more and more sensible voices coming out of the Muslim community as well. You know, it's a friend of mine, Mohammed Abbasi, is boss of the Association of British Muslims, and he has no time for any of this rubbish. Yeah, no time at all. So I think that it may well be that we'll be outflanked, as I was talking about with Black Lives Matter and so on, that there may be salient, intelligent voices beyond the white liberals in the ethnic minority communities. I don't know. Maybe that's just wishful thinking.
One of the recent times that we spoke, we talked about, I think this was at an SDP conference, actually, up in Leeds, maybe. We talked about the fact that, there are significant sections of the Muslim community that actually could be allies against wokeness. They have very little appetite for the idea that there are 72 genders, or that, their son might be treated as a girl when he goes to school. I mean, that's offensive to many people, but it's particularly offensive to more conservative people, traditional people, religious people. But where do you think things stand in terms of integration? I mean, that's one of the things that Starmer pointed to. He would probably have called himself far right if he'd said the same things 5 years ago or even 2 years ago. But it did point to the crisis of integration, the island of strangers, that, people said that had echoes of Enoch Powell. There does seem to be a broader recognition now, not just amongst wise people like you who've been saying it for some time, but amongst the establishment as well, that people aren't integrating as well as we might like. There isn't a sense of common purpose often in the United Kingdom. There are these little satellite religious ethnic communities. Do you think that's going to improve soon, or
no, I don't. I mean, I think we've built up an enormous problem for ourselves by the very simple fact of letting in far, 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 far too many people, and not being intelligent about what we do when they get here, and by often letting the wrong people in. There's an awful lot of Indians living in this country, Sikhs and Indians. Not a problem. Never been a problem. Never. You don't hear about them. You maybe see them on television at Diwali, and that's about it. It's Islam. Islam is a problem, and I think the big. You're quite right, and remember our conversation that there's a social conservatism in Islam, and also a sense of duty to the family and to elderly people, and all the kinds of stuff which we as Blue Labour or SDP or whatever would understand. The big problem is the primacy of Islam over the nation state. That is the one big philosophical hurdle, and it is a huge problem. And I see it particularly in up here, even in Middlesbrough, which never had a huge population of Pakistani immigrants or Bangladeshi immigrants. It's now a pretty scary place to be. There were, after the riots last year, there were gangs of Muslim young men going around beating up white people and smashing up cars. But we built this for ourselves, and we built it without ever saying to the electorate, look, our plan over the next 5 years is to let 2 million people into the country, most of them from backwards communities in Pakistan where they practice female circumcision. Do you fancy that? No one ever had the chance to vote on it. We were always made to think that it was a fait accompli and a natural consequence of freedom of movement and everything. It's been disastrous for us, absolutely disastrous for us. And when you hear a Labour MP channeling Enoch, you know how disastrous it's been for us.
It's, one of the worst things in recent years has been the informal restriction on having an honest discussion about any of this. I mean, you know this better than most people, because every column you've written on about this in the recent past, going back a few years, you got so much flack for it. If you ever raised the question of the problem of integration or the loss of control over our borders and the necessity of getting a handle on that stuff, I mean, you've been denounced as far right, racist, a Nazi, etc., etc. It really does demonstrate, doesn't it, that the first step to solving problems is admitting that they exist and having that honest discussion, which we couldn't have for so long.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. And there were certain subjects I simply wasn't allowed to write about. I was very anxious in 2020 to write about Black Lives Matter. No one would have it. Nobody. Couldn't do it. And it's funny, back to the personal stuff. Called racist, far right, fascist, or all that kind of stuff. And then something happened. And you know, if you're a jobbing journo, you know how high your stock stands with the people you write for. And I thought, God, I'm in real trouble here. You know, I'm not going to be able to buy a loaf of bread soon if you know, and then something happened. Trump gets elected. And I'm not kidding. Since then, I've been doing interviews for Chatham House. So, I don't think it made very much sense, but just a complete change in the way the papers, the media, suddenly started looking at these questions of immigration, of homeland security, and of wokery. They've changed completely. So I think you've just got to, in a way, though I dislike so many things about him, we have to hang on to the coattails of Donald Trump a little bit, because it genuinely has changed the way in which all these issues are framed throughout the country. You cannot keep saying it's far-right extremists when it's the entire fucking free world that is believing in this. Yeah. You can't. When you look at the growth of the AfD and the Front National and the Social Democrats in Slovakia and Trump in America and etc. and Poland back to the right, you cannot keep just saying fascist because it doesn't work anymore. You know,
it really doesn't. You know, I mean, it never worked on some of us. Some of us always thought it was Rick from the Young
we
One.
can be very smug, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You've earned the right to be smug. I fully agree with that. But I did want to ask you about Trump before we wrap up. I want to ask you about Trump because I think you're absolutely right. There has been a vibe shift, as people say, which I think is too small a phrase to describe what's actually happened. But in the US itself and around the Western world, the second coming of Donald Trump has had an extraordinary impact. And why wouldn't it? You know, 77 million people, working class people from every race, voting for this man who we were told was Hitler 2.0 because they trust him more than they trust the old establishment. I mean, that is an extraordinary epoch-defining event by anyone's standards. So does that make you think that the victory of Trump was a good thing, even despite your reservations about him, which you might say something about what your reservations are?
Yes, it was. Yes, I think it was a good thing. Almost without caveat. The caveat is that he's grotesque. That's the caveat. And I think possibly in many cases rightly has scant respect for the institutions, whether they be the constitutional institutions or otherwise. But the remarkable thing, Brendan, was that this change happened instantaneously. It wasn't something which grew over time.
Yeah.
On the first program after Trump's inauguration, I had a debate between Lord David Owen, former Labour SDP, and Humphrey Hawksley, who's a great journalist, a Chinese specialist, and a Liberal Democrat. Both were pro-Trump. Hang on, what? And earlier in the programme, we've been talking about Trump's view of the changes. We've been talking about Trump and dozing around a bit, and Trevor Phillips, Labour, CHR, for Trump. Down for Trump. and this was instantaneous. These were instantaneous changes, which you couldn't have imagined. Would have been unimaginable 2 or 3 years ago, or even 2 or 3 months ago in January. So he's completely changed the agenda and the axis upon which politics revolves. I don't go along with the Overton window theory, I'm afraid. I think it's more complex than that. But nonetheless, Trump has shifted everything, not to the right, but just away from the pusillanimous, fact-denying left.
Yeah.
It's all stopped. It's remarkable.
I think you're right that he hasn't necessarily shifted things to the right, which was the hackneyed old script we were given last time. But, this is a man who he's pretty anti-war. He doesn't like military intervention. He doesn't like the lazy, big, bloated state, but he's not against having some form of state to assist people when necessary. Many people have said it, but he's basically what a Democrat was 25 years ago, and now he's seen as kind of Adolf Hitler. It's bizarre.
Well, a blue dog Democrat, probably. Yeah. One of the Southern Democrats. Sure. And I think he's probably more left-wing than people realise. And he has been reasonably swift, because there is a division within the administration between left and right. And Trump is with the left.
Yeah.
Trump is with Bannon and Vance on the left. And he is not with Elon Musk and the libertarian side on the right. He is not with them. And I think all those complexities are very difficult for BBC people to grasp. And they still call him right wing and far right. But he's not at all, not remotely.
Yeah, I think that divide within the MAGA movement between, I guess, the Bannonite wing and the Vanceite wing, which is pro-working class or concerned about the working class, and then you have the Muskite wing, which is just this kind of libertarian, take ketamine, rip everything up, fuck the state. I mean, it's such an extraordinary tension, and as you say, it does seem as though Trump wants to resolve it more on the side of the non-Musk side rather than the Musk side.
The non-Musk side, because that's where the votes are.
Yeah.
That's where the votes are. You ain't going to win Michigan. No, if you take a Vancian, a Muskian view of the world,
Okay, Rod, my last question for you, to bring it all together, what is the prospect of something like that happening in Britain? I mean, the old romantic part of me thinks this is the country it should happen in. And it kind of did with Brexit, which preceded all of these kind of populist parties. And, the Brit-centric side of me thinks Brexit gave birth to all the other stuff that we've subsequently seen over the past few years. But Britain is, it's a country that has kicked against the pricks many times, has asserted the interests of working class communities many times, is famous for having done that over the centuries. What's the prospect for a Trumpite figure here? Can Farage play that role? Can anyone else? Do you think we will see a tearing up of the ruling regime in this country like we've seen in others?
I know that Matt Goodwin thinks we will. And he's quite reliable on voting patterns and what people are up to. And I disagreed with him about the scope that reform, the ground that they could occupy. But I think we're closer to that than we've ever been. If you look at reform on 29%, and Farage, the most popular, as well as being the most unpopular, of course. And the latest opinion poll, I think, suggested it would be 180 seats to Reform, 165 to Labour and the Tories each. I think you are then looking at the same sort of revolution which swept America, perhaps not in quite such a dramatic way. Although, believe me, if you're in a BBC studio on the morning that Nigel Farage wins the 2029 election, you will think it quite dramatic from the tears shed on the floor and the wailing and gnashing of teeth. So I think it's an outside possibility, but nowhere near as outside as it was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even with Brexit. I think there's that constituency there.
Yeah,
there are plenty of people who regret Brexit and who will still vote for reform. I think we've moved on. you know, and the more publicity reform gets, every vote they get is kind of exponential, because it means they then bring in more votes, and your neighbour voted for reform. God, well, maybe I could. You know, it can grow exponentially.
Rod, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Cheers, Brendan. Enjoyed that. Thank you.